12,000 years ago, the world was not supposed to remember anything made of wood. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Metal, if buried the right way, can endure. But wood is meant to disappear. It swells, splits, feeds fungi, collapses into soil. It is the most human of materials, warm, workable, temporary. And because of that, it is the least likely to carry memory across deep time. This is the first rule of archaeology, whether spoken aloud or silently assumed. Organic materials do not last. When a tree falls, life rushes in. Bacteria digest its fibers. Fungi lace through its cells. Insects hollow it from within. In a temperate forest, decades are enough to erase even a massive trunk. In the tropics, years can do the job. This cycle is not an exception. It is the engine of nature itself. Decay is not failure. It is how ecosystems function, which is why what you are about to hear should not exist at all. Before we talk about gods carved from trees, before we discuss dates that fracture the timeline of civilization, we need to understand just how absolute the rule of decay really is, because only then does the anomaly become clear. Archaeology, as a discipline, is biased by survival. We reconstruct the past from what remains, not from what was most important. Stone tools dominate museums not because they were the center of ancient life, but because stone does not rot. Entire theories about human intelligence, symbolism, and social organization have been built on this distorted sample. We call it the Stone Age. But that name hides a dangerous assumption. That stone was the primary medium of early human creativity. In reality, for most of human existence, stone was secondary. Wood was everywhere. It was shelters, weapons, tools, ritual objects, markers, and monuments. Forests were not empty backgrounds. They were the material foundation of life, and yet almost none of this wooden world remains. Imagine trying to understand modern civilization if all that survived were concrete foundations and a few metal screws. No books, no furniture, no art, no signs. You would conclude that modern humans were utilitarian, unimaginative, and obsessed with infrastructure. That is essentially what we have done to the deep past. The absence of wooden artifacts has quietly shaped our view of early humans as simple, pragmatic, and perpetually on the edge of survival. Hunter-gatherers, the story goes, were too busy staying alive to invest in monumental art, symbolic systems, or abstract thinking. Those things came later, after farming, after surplus, after cities. This narrative rests on one fragile assumption, that if something mattered, it would survive. But what if the opposite is true? What if the most important things were made of the most perishable materials? There are places on Earth where the rule of decay breaks down, not because time stops, but because chemistry intervenes. Peat bogs are one of those places. At first glance, a peat bog looks unremarkable, flat, wet ground choked with moss and stagnant water. But chemically, it is hostile to life. The moss releases acids that lower the pH of the environment. The water does not flow, which means oxygen is scarce. Without oxygen, the microorganisms that normally consume organic matter cannot function. The result is a natural vault. Bodies fall into bogs and emerge centuries later with skin intact. Leather, textiles, and, on extremely rare occasions, wood survive not by resisting decay, but by being chemically excluded from it. The bog does not preserve by protection. It preserves by poisoning the process of decomposition itself. These environments are statistical miracles. For an object to be preserved, it must fall into the bog at exactly the right moment, sink to the right depth, and remain undisturbed for millennia. A difference of a few meters can mean the difference between perfect preservation and total erasure. This is not a system designed to preserve history. It is a system that occasionally fails to destroy it. In the late 19th century, no one was thinking about ancient memory or the deep past of humanity. Industrial Europe was hungry for gold, for coal, for anything that could be extracted and turned into wealth. In the Ural Mountains of central Russia, men dug into peat not for archaeology, but for profit. They cut through layers of soggy, decaying plant matter, draining wetlands that had been forming since the last ice age. Peat was an obstacle between them and the gravel below, where gold might be hiding. Then, deep underground, their tools struck something solid. Not stone, not metal, wood. At first it meant nothing. Old logs were common in bogs, but as the mud was scraped away, something unnatural appeared. Flat surfaces, straight edges, intentional cuts. This was not driftwood. This was craftsmanship. Someone, long before written history, had taken a massive tree and transformed it. At the time, no one understood the scale of what had been uncovered. The fragments were collected, documented, and stored away. They were curiosities, odd survivals, nothing more. The assumption was automatic and unchallenged. Whatever this object was, it could not be very old, because wood does not survive 12,000 years. Except it had. And that single contradiction, wood where wood should not exist, is the crack through which an entirely different vision of the human past begins to emerge. Before dates, before faces carved into grain, before codes etched into a tree older than civilization itself, there is only this question. If wood was once the primary canvas of human culture, how much of our history has simply rotted away? And what happens when, by accident, one fragment refuses to disappear? In the next part, we descend into the chemistry of a Siberian peat bog and into the moment when decay lost its grip on time. To understand how something impossible survived, we have to step away from history and into chemistry. Peat bogs are not passive landscapes. They are slow, hostile systems that quietly rewrite the rules of preservation. Unlike rivers or forests, a bog does not circulate life. It traps it. The surface is deceptive. Moss grows thick and soft, forming a floating skin. Beneath it lies water that barely moves, starved of oxygen. As the moss dies, it sinks, compresses, and becomes peat, a dense, acidic mass of partially decayed plant matter. Over centuries, layer upon layer accumulates, sealing whatever falls inside. This is where decay fails. The microorganisms that normally dismantle wood, fungi, bacteria, insects, depend on oxygen. Remove oxygen, lower the pH, and their machinery collapses. The bog does not preserve by drying or freezing. It preserves by chemical suffocation. Organic material entering this environment is not protected, it is arrested. The Siberian bog where our story turns, known as the Siberian peat bog, formed at the end of the last ice age. As glaciers retreated, meltwater pooled across the lowlands of the Urals. Forests crept north. Moss followed. And slowly, invisibly, a chemical vault assembled itself. By the 19th century, this vault was in the way. Industrial mining does not move delicately. In 1890, gold prospectors cut deep trenches through the bog, draining it, slicing through layers that had not seen air since mammoths still roamed the plains. Peat was shoveled aside like waste. Then, 4 meters down, the shovel struck resistance. What emerged was not a fallen branch or buried stump. It was heavy, dark, waterlogged wood, unnaturally intact. The surface was stained black by tannins, but beneath the mud were straight planes and sharp angles. Someone had shaped this tree with intent. As more fragments were pulled free, the pattern became undeniable. This was not debris. This was a constructed object, broken by time, but not erased by it. The fragments were transported to a museum in what is now Yekaterinburg. There, they were cleaned, catalogued, and partially reassembled. What emerged was tall, far taller than expected, and unmistakably anthropomorphic. A face stared out from the grain, severe and abstract, carved with confidence. But here is the crucial detail. No one panicked. Because at the time, there was no reason to. The assumption that governed all interpretation was simple and unquestioned. Wood cannot be ancient. Therefore, this object must be recent, perhaps a few centuries old. Maybe the work of local indigenous groups. Interesting, but not revolutionary. It was labeled, it was stored, and for decades it slept. This is how anomalies often enter history, not as explosions, but as quiet misclassifications. When evidence does not fit a model, the model is protected. The evidence is downsized. No one suspected they were looking at a survivor from a vanished wooden world. But the bog had already done its work. It had preserved not just the object, but the marks of its creation. Tool cuts were still visible. Grain patterns remained sharp. Even the internal structure of the tree, the growth rings, were intact enough to count. The chemistry had frozen the moment of carving in place. Peat bogs are cruel archivists. They preserve without context. They save objects, but destroy explanations. The people who carved this tree left no writing, no descendants to explain its meaning. All that survived was the artifact itself, ripped from its cultural ecosystem and delivered naked to modern science. And that is when the second rule of archaeology was challenged. If wood could survive, then perhaps time was not as neat as we thought. For nearly a century the object sat in limbo, too strange to ignore, too inconvenient to confront. It was measured, sketched, and debated, but never truly understood. Until the late 20th century, when physics, not archaeology, finally asked the question no one wanted to hear. How old is it really? Because once that question was answered, there would be no going back. In the next part, a laboratory test returns a number that fractures the timeline and forces archaeologists into denial. For most of its modern life, the object known as the Shigir idol existed in a kind of archaeological purgatory. It was visible, measurable, undeniable, yet safely ignored. Not because it was insignificant, but because no one had forced it to answer the most dangerous question in science. When were you made? Dating an artifact is not a neutral act. It is a confrontation. A number has consequences. It can validate decades of theory, or dismantle them overnight. And when the material is wood, the stakes are even higher. Wood is supposed to behave. Wood is supposed to confirm expectations. By the 1990s, archaeology had changed. Radiocarbon dating had matured. Precision improved. The margins of error narrowed. And the Shigir idol, tall and silent in its museum case, became impossible to avoid. In 1997, scientists finally took samples from the wood and sent them for radiocarbon analysis. The method is elegant in its brutality. While alive, trees absorb carbon from the atmosphere, including a radioactive isotope known as carbon-14. When the tree is cut down, that intake stops. From that moment forward, carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate. Measure what remains, and you can calculate how long it has been since the organism died. It is a clock no culture can reset. When the results came back, they were not dramatic. They were worse, approximately 9,500 years old. The number landed like a dead weight. If true, this meant the idol was older than the earliest cities, older than writing, older than agriculture in most of the world, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by several millennia. It meant that hunter-gatherers, people long assumed to live in small, desperate bands, had carved a monumental, multi-meter ritual object at the end of the Ice Age. The reaction was not excitement, it was rejection. The archaeological community did not rally around the discovery. It resisted it. The objections came quickly, and they were technical, but revealing. Perhaps the wood itself was old, they argued, but the carving was much later. Trees can live for centuries. Radiocarbon dating might have measured the inner heartwood, not the outer layer where the carving was made. The date could be misleading. Perhaps contamination had skewed the results. Bogs are chemically complex environments. Maybe the sample absorbed ancient carbon from the water, artificially inflating its age. Perhaps the lab had made an error. Every explanation shared one thing in common. The timeline had to be protected. Because if the date was correct, it did more than add a new artifact to the record. It rewrote the cognitive profile of Mesolithic humans. It suggested long-term planning, symbolic abstraction, and social organization far beyond what the existing model allowed. So the idol waited again. For more than 20 years, it existed in a state of suspended disbelief, too old to accept, too solid to dismiss. The drawings from its early reconstruction showed a figure once standing over 5 meters tall, towering over a post-glacial forest. But without absolute certainty, the implications were safely postponed until technology caught up with the question. In 2018, an international team of researchers decided to settle the matter using a more advanced method: accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS. Unlike traditional radiocarbon dating, which measures radioactive decay indirectly, AMS counts individual carbon-14 atoms. It requires far smaller samples and delivers far greater precision. More importantly, it allows scientists to target specific growth layers of the wood. This time, there would be no ambiguity. Samples were taken from the outermost rings of the tree, the part that was alive at the moment the idol was carved. The margin for debate was eliminated by design. When the AMS results came back, they did not soften the problem. They sharpened it. Approximately 12,100 years old. Not 9,000, not 8, 12. The Shigir idol was carved at the very end of the last ice age. When this tree was cut down, glaciers still dominated the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were far lower. Woolly mammoths had not yet vanished from the Siberian mainland. Agriculture did not exist in the region. Metal tools were unknown. Writing was unimaginable. And yet, someone had selected a massive, centuries-old larch tree, felled it with stone tools, processed it while the wood was fresh, and transformed it into a towering, abstract, symbolic figure. This was not decoration. This was not idle craft. This was monumentality. The implications were immediate and uncomfortable. If hunter-gatherers could produce something like this, then the standard narrative, progress moving cleanly from survival to symbolism, was incomplete, perhaps even wrong. The Shigir idol did not just predate civilization. It suggested that civilization did not invent symbolic complexity. It inherited it. And suddenly, the most disturbing question was no longer about the object itself, but about us. What else once existed, made of wood, fiber, and skin, that never fell into a bog? If one statue survived by accident, how many others were lost by default? In the next part, we examine the people who carved this impossible object and why their world was far more stable, organized, and intentional than we were ever taught to believe. Once the date was no longer negotiable, the focus shifted to a harder problem. Who could have made this, and how? 12,000 years ago, the Ural region was not a frozen wasteland, but it was not forgiving either. The Ice Age was ending. Glaciers were retreating. Forests were advancing north into freshly exposed land. The climate was unstable, swinging between cold snaps and sudden warming. This was a world in transition. The people who lived here are classified as Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. That label carries baggage. It implies mobility, small group size, and a life structured around immediate needs. It does not imply long-term projects, coordinated labor, or monuments that require weeks, perhaps months, of focused effort. And yet, the Shigir idol demands exactly those things. Start with the tree itself. The idol was carved from a larch trunk, dense, resinous, and extremely tough. This was not a fallen sapling picked up by chance. Growth ring analysis shows the tree was over 150 years old when it was cut. That means the people who chose it selected a massive, ancient tree, knowing it would hold form and resist splitting. Cutting such a tree with stone tools is not trivial. Polished stone adzes, essentially axes, leave distinctive marks, and those marks are still visible on the surface of the idol. Microscopic analysis reveals controlled strikes, consistent angles, and deliberate smoothing. This was not brute force. It was skilled woodworking. The carving had to be done while the wood was fresh. Once larch dries, it becomes brittle and difficult to shape. That implies planning, felling, transporting, carving, all coordinated within a narrow window of time. Then there is the scale. When first reconstructed in the early 20th century, the idol stood over 5 meters tall. That is roughly the height of a 2-story building. Today, it is shorter, about 3.4 meters, because the lower section was lost during the chaos of the 20th century. But early drawings confirm its original proportions. This changes everything. A 5-meter object is not portable art. It is not personal expression. It is public. It is meant to be seen. It dominates space. It reorganizes attention. To carve something this large requires more than one person. It requires cooperation, division of labor, time not spent hunting or gathering. That, in turn, implies stability, which leads to an uncomfortable realization. The people who made the Shigir idol were not scraping by at the edge of starvation. The post-glacial forests were rich: nuts, berries, fish, game. Seasonal abundance created windows of surplus. These were affluent foragers, not desperate survivors. Affluence changes behavior. It allows ritual. It allows specialization. It allows memory to take physical form. Tool marks on the idol reveal a sophisticated toolkit. In addition to stone adzes and chisels, researchers identified fine grooves likely made with beaver incisors, lower jaws used as carving implements. Beaver teeth are incredibly hard, naturally sharpened, and ideal for gouging deep lines into wood. This is improvisation at a high level. Every mark on the surface records a decision. The face at the top is abstract but intentional. The mouth is open. The eyes are stark. Below it, the body becomes a flat plank covered in geometric carving. This was not an attempt to imitate nature. It was an attempt to encode something. The idol was not shaped like a human because the goal was realism. It was shaped that way because humans recognize authority in faces and verticality. A towering figure rising from the forest floor is not just an object. It is a presence, and presence is power. Where did it stand? Evidence suggests the idol was not deeply buried or fixed like a fence post. The base tapers. Weathering patterns indicate it stood upright for decades, perhaps 20 to 50 years, before falling or being placed into the bog. During that time, it would have been visible from a distance, a singular vertical line in a dense, horizontal forest. Children would have grown up under its gaze. Stories would have been told about it. Gatherings would have oriented around it. Whether it marked territory, ancestry, or cosmology, it functioned as a social anchor. This is not speculation drawn from fantasy. It is deduction drawn from labor. People do not invest this much effort without a reason that matters to the group, which forces us to abandon another assumption. Monumentality does not require agriculture. It requires meaning. The Shigir idol proves that symbolic authority, ritualized, encoded, and physically imposing, existed long before cities, long before kings, long before writing. It belonged to a forest world we barely glimpse. But the true shock is not its size or its age, it is the surface. Because once scientists began to really look at the carvings, at the lines, the patterns, the hidden faces, it became clear that this was not just a statue, it was a message. In the next part, we read the wood itself and discover a coded language etched into grain, geometry, and 7 silent faces. Once archaeologists accepted that the Shigir idol was real, ancient, and intentional, a deeper problem emerged. What was it actually saying? At first glance, the idol appears simple, almost crude. A tall plank, a face at the top, lines carved into wood. But simplicity is deceptive. When modern researchers began examining the surface using high-resolution photography, microscopy, and 3D scanning, the object revealed a level of complexity that had gone unnoticed for more than a century. This was not decoration, it was structure. The most obvious feature is the head at the top. The face is elongated, with deep-set eyes and a mouth frozen open in an ambiguous expression. It does not smile, it does not threaten, it watches. The geometry of the face is deliberate, symmetry where it matters, distortion where it carries meaning. The eyes are not placed for realism, but for confrontation. Below this primary face, the body of the idol flattens into a rectangular shaft. This is where the true mystery begins. Hidden within the carved patterns are 7 additional faces. They are not obvious. Some are fully formed, others only emerge when viewed from a specific angle or under raking light. The grain of the wood itself becomes part of the illusion. A line that appears decorative suddenly becomes a brow ridge. A zigzag resolves into a jaw. These faces are not mistakes. They are intentionally embedded, camouflaged within the geometry. Crucially, they are not placed randomly. 3 faces appear on the front of the idol, 3 on the back. 1 dominates the top. This vertical arrangement strongly suggests hierarchy. Across cultures separated by thousands of years and kilometers, humans repeatedly divide reality into layers: sky, earth, underworld, upper forces, living world, ancestral realm. The Shigir idol appears to encode this same cosmological logic, stacked beings occupying different levels of existence. If this interpretation is correct, then the idol is not a statue of a god. It is a map of the universe. The geometric carvings reinforce this idea. Zigzags, chevrons, straight lines, cross-hatching. These are not filler patterns. In traditional societies, geometric motifs function as symbolic language. A zigzag can represent water, a serpent, danger, transformation. Straight lines often mark boundaries or horizons. Cross-hatching can indicate barriers, nets, or thresholds between worlds. What matters is not a single symbol, but their sequence. When read vertically, the patterns change as you move from one face to another. The carving density shifts. The rhythm alters. It is entirely possible that the idol was meant to be read from top to bottom, like a storyboard or a mnemonic device, encoding myths, laws, or ancestral genealogies. In this sense, the Shigir idol may be one of the oldest narrative objects ever discovered. A book written in wood, but we no longer speak its language. Without the cultural key, the symbols remain encrypted. We can identify structure without meaning, syntax without vocabulary. It is the archaeological equivalent of finding a hard drive without the software to open it. Yet comparisons offer unsettling clues. The abstract style, elongated figures, emphasis on faces, internal structures hinted rather than shown, bears an eerie resemblance to ritual art found thousands of kilometers away and roughly the same age. Sites like Göbekli Tepe show that immediately after the Ice Age, humans across Eurasia began constructing monumental, symbol-heavy ritual objects before farming societies stabilized. This challenges the old progression model. Art did not slowly evolve from simple to complex. It appeared fully symbolic almost instantly. The Shigir idol fits this pattern perfectly. It is not experimental, it is confident. Whoever carved it was not inventing symbolism. They were participating in a system that already existed. There is also a darker interpretation. The open mouth of the top face has troubled researchers. It could be singing, chanting, breathing, or issuing a warning. In Siberian shamanic traditions, spirits are not benevolent abstractions. They are dangerous forces that must be negotiated with. Totems are not decorative. They are containment devices. A 5-meter wooden figure looming over a forest clearing is not passive art. It is a psychological structure, a boundary marker, a reminder. Some archaeologists believe the idol marked sacred territory. Others think it served as a ritual focus for seasonal gatherings, a place where scattered bands reunited, exchanged goods, arranged marriages, and performed ceremonies. Either way, its function was social as much as spiritual, and then it disappeared. Whether the idol fell naturally, was deliberately lowered, or was ritually retired into the bog remains unknown. But many ancient cultures viewed wetlands as liminal spaces, gateways between worlds. Depositing powerful objects into water was not disposal, it was communication. If the Shigir idol was placed into the bog intentionally, it may not have been abandoned, it may have been sent. which leaves us with a final, unsettling thought. If this one object survived by accident, preserved by chemistry rather than intention, then the Mesolithic world was likely filled with wooden monuments, ritual poles, and symbolic structures that have vanished without a trace. We are not missing footnotes. We are missing libraries. In the next part, we leave the frozen forests behind and move south into a desert where humans learn to turn fire, stone, and chemistry into gods made of plaster. The Shigir idol forces us to rethink what hunter-gatherers were capable of. But to understand how radical that realization truly is, we now have to move forward in time and into a completely different environment. From cold, waterlogged forests to heat, dust, and fire. Roughly 3,000 years after the Shigir idol was carved, humanity crossed a threshold it would never reverse. People in parts of the Near East stopped wandering. They built permanent settlements. They domesticated plants and animals. And in doing so, they began reshaping not just landscapes, but themselves. One of those places was Ain Ghazal, on the banks of the Zarqa River near modern-day Amman. At first glance, Ain Ghazal looks like a typical early Neolithic village. Mud brick houses, stone tools, burials beneath floors. But beneath that familiar surface lies something far more unsettling. This was not just a farming community, it was an industrial experiment. By around 7,250 BC, Ain Ghazal had grown into one of the largest settlements on Earth. While most Neolithic villages housed a few hundred people, this place supported over 2,000. For its time, it was a megacity. And megacities create problems. Crowding brings disease, resource competition, social tension, new forms of inequality. Humans had never lived this close together before, and there was no inherited blueprint for managing it. The solution Ain Ghazal chose was not political. It was chemical. The key material was lime plaster. This is not clay, not mud. Lime plaster is synthetic. It requires a controlled, multi-stage process known as the lime cycle. First, limestone, calcium carbonate, must be quarried and crushed. Then it must be heated in a kiln to temperatures between 800 and 900 degrees Celsius. That heat does something irreversible. It drives carbon dioxide out of the stone, transforming it into quicklime, calcium oxide. This substance is caustic, unstable, and dangerous to handle. Add water, and it reacts violently, boiling and releasing heat. What remains is slaked lime, a workable paste that can be molded and shaped. As it dries, it reabsorbs carbon dioxide from the air and hardens back into stone. This is not primitive technology. It is industrial chemistry. Maintaining those temperatures required enormous quantities of fuel. Wood, brush, entire hillsides stripped bare. The people of Ain Ghazal were not just building houses, they were running kilns continuously, on a scale never seen before. They plastered their floors white. They polished them smooth. The surface was clean, reflective, almost luminous. In a dusty world, this mattered. The house became a controlled environment, separated from the chaos outside. But floors were not the end point. They used the same material to build something else. Something that looks back at you. Life-sized human figures, standing statues made entirely of lime plaster. This alone should stop us. Freestanding human sculpture of this scale should not exist in 7000 BC. According to the old model, monumental art comes after states, after writing, after kings. Ain Ghazal did not wait. These figures were built with internal armatures, bundles of reeds tied together to form a skeleton. The plaster was applied over this framework, creating a composite structure, organic core, mineral shell. The same principle used in reinforced concrete today. The eyes are what most people remember: white plaster, black pupils made of bitumen, a natural asphalt that had to be imported from far away, likely the Dead Sea region. This implies trade networks, logistics, planning. Someone carried toxic black tar across the desert, so that these figures could see. They were painted too. Red ochre highlighted features, clothing, perhaps tattoos. Originally, they would have been vivid, stark, and deeply unsettling. Bright white bodies staring out from dim mud brick interiors. There were two types, full-standing figures, and double-headed busts, two faces, one torso. This was not aesthetic experimentation. It was symbolic architecture. The energy cost of producing these statues was enormous. Burning forests to make gods is not sustainable, and yet the community kept doing it again and again, which forces a difficult question. Why invest so much effort into objects that cannot feed you, shelter you, or defend you? The answer likely lies in what Ain Ghazal was trying to hold together. When humans cluster at this scale for the first time, something must enforce cohesion. Belief systems do that. Ritual does that. Shared symbols do that. These statues were not art. They were infrastructure, psychological infrastructure. They watched. They reminded. They anchored identity. But no system built on burning its own environment lasts forever. And the people of Ain Ghazal would learn that lesson the hard way. In the next part, we examine how these chemically engineered gods were treated like human beings, and why they were buried instead of destroyed. At Ain Ghazal, the most disturbing detail is not how the statues were made. It is how they were treated. When archaeologists first uncovered them in the 1980s, the discovery did not resemble a collapsed shrine or a ruined temple. There was no hall of fallen idols, no broken fragments scattered by time. Instead, the statues were found buried, carefully. They lay beneath the floors of houses, sealed under layers of plaster and earth. Their placement was deliberate, their orientation consistent. In some cases, the figures had been intentionally broken, not smashed, but deactivated, as if a specific ritual procedure had been followed. This was not disposal, it was burial. To understand why that matters, we have to step into a Neolithic mindset. In many early societies, an image does not represent an entity, it hosts it. This concept, often called iconic realism or sympathetic embodiment, means that a statue is not symbolic in the modern sense. It is functional. It is a vessel. The line between object and being is thin, sometimes non-existent. If that is true, then burying a statue is not getting rid of art. It is giving something a funeral. At Ain Ghazal, houses were not just shelters. They were ritual spaces. Families buried their dead beneath the floors. In some cases, bodies were interred without heads. Later, the skulls were retrieved, modelled over with plaster, and given new faces. Cowrie shells were placed in the eye sockets. These plastered skulls were then displayed or stored within the household. The face mattered. Identity was concentrated there. The large statues appear to be an extension of this practice. While a plastered skull preserved the identity of a specific individual, the statues likely represented something larger, founding ancestors, clan progenitors, or collective lineages. The double-headed busts push this idea even further. Two faces, one body. This could represent dual ancestry, the union of clans, or the fusion of hunter-gatherer and farmer populations as the region transitioned into settled life. Genetic evidence suggests Ain Ghazal was a melting pot, absorbing newcomers as environments shifted and nomadic groups sought stability. The statues may have embodied political compromise. Two peoples, one community. But statues with eyes that never close have consequences. Living in a town of thousands under constant observation, real or imagined, changes behavior. These figures were not tucked away. Before burial, they would have stood inside homes or communal spaces, staring outward with bitumen pupils that absorbed light rather than reflected it. They did not blink. They did not sleep. This creates a form of social pressure that requires no guards, no laws, no written codes. You behave because the ancestors are watching. You contribute because the watchers demand it. You obey because disobedience is visible, even in private. The statues were instruments of cohesion, but they were also fragile. Chemical analysis reveals that the plaster used for the statues is identical to that used for flooring. There was no special formula for gods. The divine was made from the same material people walked on every day. This was not accidental. It suggests a worldview where the sacred and the domestic were inseparable. The house was not just a home, it was a shrine. The floor was not just a surface, it was a boundary between worlds. And like the floors, the statues were never meant to last forever. The reed armatures inside them would rot. The plaster shells would hollow. Over time, the figures would weaken. This impermanence appears intentional. These were not eternal monuments. They were generational devices, used, retired, replaced. So why bury them? Because in this worldview, power does not disappear when it becomes inconvenient. It must be neutralized, sealed, put to rest in the ground, where it cannot interfere with the living. By placing the statues beneath the floors, the people of Ain Ghazal did something profound. They built their daily lives directly on top of their ancestors, literally standing on lineage, memory, and obligation. The past supported the present, but there is a darker possibility. Some anthropologists suggest the statues were not just revered, but feared, that they absorbed collective anxiety, illness, or social tension. In this interpretation, burying them was an act of containment, a way to lock away something volatile once it had served its purpose. If true, Ain Ghazal was not just inventing chemistry, it was inventing psychological engineering. And like all systems that demand constant fuel, literal or symbolic, it eventually failed. The forests thinned, kilns burned hotter, plaster quality declined. Later layers of the site show shortcuts, substitutions, regression. The energy source that powered this society, wood, ran out. And when it did, the gods were buried, the city emptied, and the experiment ended. Humanity would not attempt anything like this again for thousands of years. In the next part, we leave buried watchers behind and move into open air, to a mountain where faces may or may not be real, and where geology itself becomes part of the mystery. After the sealed floors of Ain Ghazal, the next transition is not just geographical, it is perceptual. We move from enclosed domestic spaces to open, thin air. From buried figures, hidden beneath houses, to faces that stare out from an entire mountain. High in the Andes of central Peru, at over 4,000 meters above sea level, lies the Marcahuasi Plateau. This is not a gentle place. The air is thin, the sun burns, the nights freeze. Sound travels strangely here, carried by wind through corridors of stone. For centuries, travelers have described the same unsettling sensation upon arrival. The landscape feels watched. Scattered across this volcanic plateau are massive rock formations that resemble something else. Faces, animals, helmets, altars. The most famous formation, often called the Monument to Humanity, appears from a precise angle as a colossal human profile carved directly into the mountain. From another angle, it disappears. This is the core of the Marcahuasi mystery. Are these sculptures? Or are they accidents of geology that our brains cannot stop interpreting as intention? To approach this question, we have to start with the rock itself. The plateau is composed primarily of volcanic tuff and ignimbrite, materials formed from ash and debris ejected during explosive volcanic eruptions millions of years ago. When this material settles, it is hot and soft. As it cools, it welds into stone, but cooling stone cracks. These cracks, called cooling joints, create weaknesses. Over geological time, wind, rain, and freeze-thaw cycles exploit them. Softer areas erode faster than harder ones. The result is differential erosion. This process can create bizarre, highly specific shapes. Hoodoos, spires, balanced rocks. We see this elsewhere on Earth, in Cappadocia, in Bryce Canyon, in volcanic regions across the world. Nature is fully capable of producing structures that look intentional, and yet Marca Huasi is not a single formation. It is dozens. Faces with brows, noses, and chins. Animal forms with recognizable silhouettes. Human profiles that align too neatly to be dismissed easily. The density of these simulacra within a relatively small area is what raises eyebrows. Geologists argue that this is a classic case of pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random data. Our brains are evolutionarily wired to detect facial features even when none exist. A shadow becomes an eye. A crack becomes a mouth. They point out that many Marca Huasi figures only appear from specific viewpoints or under certain lighting conditions. Move a few meters, and the illusion collapses. Change the angle of the sun, and the face dissolves back into stone. Case closed? Not quite. Because ancient sculptors did not need to carve everything from scratch. Across the Andes, we see a practice archaeologists call enhancement. Natural rock formations were identified as sacred, huacas, and then subtly modified. A groove deepened, a line sharpened, a shadow emphasized. The goal was not realism. It was recognition. If Marca Huasi was treated this way, then erosion over thousands of years would blur the boundary between natural and artificial beyond recovery. Tool marks would vanish. Intent would become ambiguous. And ambiguity is exactly what we see. The lighting argument cuts both ways. Skeptics see it as proof of illusion. Others see design. A face that appears only at sunrise or during a solstice is not a flaw. It is a feature. Using the sun as a moving chisel requires astronomical awareness. We know the plateau was inhabited. Stone huts, terraces, and burial structures date from roughly 800 AD to the late pre-Inca period. People lived here. They farmed below. They buried their dead among the rocks. They interacted with this landscape. The question is not whether humans were present. It is whether the faces came before them, or because of them. The most conservative explanation is also the most unsettling. Marca Huasi may be a collaboration between geology and belief. Natural shapes interpreted as spirits. Spirits honored, named, and subtly shaped. Over centuries, meaning layered onto stone until no clean line remained between nature and culture. This would explain everything. Why there are no clear tool marks. Why the forms feel intentional but resist proof. Why the site still produces unease. Because in a shamanic worldview, a rock does not need to be carved into a god. It only needs to be awakened. In the next part, we meet the man who believed Marca Huasi was not just sacred, but a message left by a lost civilization facing extinction. In the middle of the 20th century, Marca Huasi stopped being just a strange landscape. It became an obsession. The man responsible for that shift was not an archaeologist in the conventional sense. He was a Peruvian scholar, explorer, and philosopher who arrived on the plateau and refused to leave. He lived there for years, alone among the rocks, mapping, photographing, and cataloguing the formations with an intensity that unsettled even his supporters. He believed Marca Huasi was not ambiguous at all. He believed it was deliberate. According to his interpretation, the faces on the plateau were not the product of chance erosion or minor human enhancement. They were remnants of something far older, a civilization that predated known Andean cultures and possibly predated the end of the last ice age. In his view, Marca Huasi was a stone archive, a warning. He argued that the figures were too eroded, too massive, and too symbolically universal to belong to any historically documented society in the region. The imagery did not reflect local ethnic styles alone. Instead, he claimed to identify faces representing multiple human types, African, Asian, European, and indigenous, carved into the same stone bodies. This was not art, he insisted. It was testimony. The theory he proposed was radical, but internally coherent. He suggested that humanity has passed through multiple cycles of destruction, floods, climatic collapses, cataclysms large enough to erase entire civilizations. Each cycle leaves survivors, but very little memory. Knowing this, a prehistoric global culture, one facing its own extinction, sought a way to communicate across deep time. Paper rots, wood burns, metal corrodes, but mountains endure. Marcahuasi, in this interpretation, was chosen not for beauty, but for stability. Its volcanic rock, its elevation, its resistance to erosion. The figures were not meant to be admired up close. They were meant to survive. He claimed the sculptures were designed to activate through light. As the sun moved across the sky, different faces emerged, different profiles appeared. A single formation could reveal multiple identities over the course of a day. A stone memory that unfolded in time. The most prominent figure, the so-called monument to humanity, was central to this idea. From one angle, it appeared as a single colossal head. From another, it fractured into multiple faces. He counted more than a dozen embedded profiles within the same structure. To him, this was not coincidence. It was a message. We were many. We were one. Mainstream archaeology rejected this interpretation outright. There is no evidence of a lost global civilization in the Andes dating to the Ice Age. No tools, no settlements, no genetic trace. The geological age of the rock itself is millions of years old, not sculpted from poured material or reshaped at scale. And yet, dismissal did not erase the discomfort. Because while his conclusions may have outrun the evidence, his instincts touch something real. Human history is not as linear as once believed. Large-scale earthworks in the Amazon, ancient cities hidden beneath jungle canopies, agricultural manipulation thousands of years older than expected. Again and again, the timeline has had to expand. What Marcahuasi exposed was not proof of a lost civilization, but the fragility of certainty. When forms sit exactly at the boundary between nature and intention, science hesitates. Not because it lacks tools, but because it lacks categories. Is this geology shaped by chance, or belief shaped by stone? Perhaps both. The most grounded explanation now emerging is not a binary one. Ancient people did not carve Marcahuasi from nothing. They also did not merely imagine it. They encountered a landscape already suggestive, already alive with form, and responded to it. They named the faces. They told stories about them. They may have sharpened edges, cleared lines, emphasized silhouettes. Over centuries, erosion erased the difference. What remains is ambiguity. And ambiguity, in ritual cultures, is power. A face that might be a rock is more dangerous than a face that is clearly a statue. It exists in two worlds at once. It cannot be fully controlled or dismissed, which may be the point. Marcahuasi does not prove a lost Ice Age civilization, but it proves something equally important, that ancient humans did not experience landscapes as inert backdrops. Mountains were not scenery. They were participants. The stone watched back, and when belief, fear, and geology intersect, the result is not evidence, it is endurance. In the next part, we leave the realm of ambiguity behind and enter a world of paperwork, orders, and imperial certainty, where 5,000 Roman soldiers disappear without a trace. If Marcahuasi exists in ambiguity, the next mystery should not. Empires are not vague. They are administrative machines. They count, they record, they audit, they write everything down. No empire did this better than Rome. The Roman military was not a loose collection of warriors. It was the most bureaucratically sophisticated fighting force the ancient world ever produced. A legion had payrolls, supply chains, medical staff, engineers, and standardized equipment. Soldiers signed contracts. Veterans received pensions. Every movement was logged. Every loss was accounted for. This is why the disappearance of the 9th Legion is not just strange. It is disturbing. A full Roman legion consisted of roughly 5,000 heavy infantry, supported by cavalry, auxiliaries, servants, and slaves. In total, between 6,000 and 7,000 people moved as a single unit. Losing one was equivalent to losing a small city, and yet, Sometime in the early 2nd century AD, one of Rome's most experienced legions simply vanishes. The unit in question had a long and distinguished history. It fought under Julius Caesar, it earned honours in Spain, it participated in the conquest of Britain after AD 43 and was stationed in the north, at the frontier between Roman control and the unknown. For decades, it was Rome's hammer in a hostile land. Then the records stop. Official documents no longer mention the legion. Inscriptions cease. Honours are never renewed. No monument commemorates its service. No historian records its destruction. For a state obsessed with memory and reputation, this silence is deafening. The popular explanation, familiar from novels and films, is simple and dramatic. The 9th Legion marched north into the fog-covered highlands of Britain and was annihilated by tribal forces. An entire legion destroyed in hostile territory. It makes for a compelling story, but Rome did not forget disasters. When 3 legions were wiped out in the Teutoburg forest a century earlier, the trauma echoed for generations. Poets wrote about it. Emperors obsessed over it. The event reshaped Roman strategy permanently. If the 9th Legion had been slaughtered in Britain, we would expect outrage, analysis, blame, memorials. Instead, we find nothing. That absence forces a reconsideration. Archaeology has tried to solve the mystery by looking for physical evidence: mass graves, broken armour, burned forts. In northern Britain and southern Scotland, signs of violent conflict exist. Sling bullets, scorched layers, abandoned camps, but none can be conclusively tied to the 9th. Then, a problem emerged. In the Netherlands, at a Roman fortress site, archaeologists uncovered tiles stamped with the mark of the 9th Legion. The dating of these tiles places them after the time the legion was supposed to have been destroyed in Britain. That single fact collapses the massacre theory. A legion cannot die in Scotland and manufacture building materials on the continent years later. This shifts the narrative from battlefield catastrophe to administrative disappearance. One possibility is transfer. The early 2nd century was a turbulent time for the empire. Wars flared in the east. Revolts demanded reinforcements. Legions were moved, split, merged, or quietly reassigned. A unit that suffered heavy losses might be broken apart, its survivors absorbed into other formations. In such cases, the legion does not die gloriously. It dissolves. Another possibility is disgrace. Roman military culture was ruthless. Units that fled, mutinied, or failed catastrophically could be punished through decimation, killing 1 in 10 soldiers, or disbandment. A disgraced legion's name could be erased, its eagle standard removed, its identity deleted. In bureaucratic terms, this is worse than death. It is erasure. There is also the Eastern War theory. The legion may have been transferred to Judea or Armenia, where Rome faced brutal, grinding conflicts. In those theatres, losses were often folded into broader casualty figures. Units wore down slowly by disease, attrition, and exhaustion until they ceased to exist as coherent formations. No single disaster, no dramatic end, just administrative entropy. What makes this unsettling is not the uncertainty of the outcome, but the nature of the evidence. The 9th Legion left behind just enough material, stamps, inscriptions, scattered mentions, to confirm it existed beyond Britain, but not enough to explain how it ended. The result is a historical ghost, not lost in battle, lost in paperwork. And this reveals something uncomfortable about how history works. We tend to imagine the past as a sequence of dramatic events, battles, collapses, moments of clear cause and effect. But much of reality disappears quietly, through reassignment, through neglect, through decisions recorded once and then forgotten. The 9th Legion may not have vanished in blood. It may have vanished in ink. In the next part, we follow the remaining traces of this lost unit and ask whether Rome chose to forget it or whether forgetting was simply easier than remembering. The most unsettling possibility about the Ninth Legion is not that it died, it is that it was removed. In Roman culture, memory was political. To be remembered was an honor. To be forgotten was punishment. Names could be carved into stone or struck from it. Statues could be raised or pulled down. This practice had a name: damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. It was not used lightly. It was reserved for emperors, generals, and officials whose actions threatened the moral order of the state. Their images were destroyed, their names erased from inscriptions. It was as if they had never existed. But a legion, erasing an entire legion, would be extraordinary. And yet, the pattern fits uncomfortably well. There is no triumph commemorating the Ninth's victories after Britain, no funeral monument marking its end, no historian describing its final stand. Even the legion's eagle, its most sacred symbol, never reappears in the record. It simply stops. Some scholars argue that this silence itself is evidence. Rome did not hide defeats out of shame, it hid instability. A legion that mutinied, defected, or failed to hold a frontier could undermine confidence across the empire. Better to quietly dissolve it than to immortalize its failure. There is precedent. Other legions disappeared without dramatic endings. Units were merged, renamed, or retired when they became liabilities. In these cases, the bureaucracy does not announce a death. It files a transfer. It reallocates manpower. It moves on. What makes the Ninth different is how complete the silence is. No veterans' inscriptions. No retirement settlements clearly tied to it. No late references at all. It is as if the Legion crossed an administrative event horizon. Archaeology adds another layer to the mystery. Isotope analysis of Roman skeletons found in Britain reveals soldiers from across the empire. North Africa, the Danube, the Mediterranean. The army was diverse, mobile, and constantly in flux. Units were rarely static. Men were transferred. Recruits replaced losses. In such a system, identity was fragile. If the Ninth Legion was gradually stripped of personnel, broken into detachments, and absorbed elsewhere, its name could disappear long before its soldiers did. Men lived on. The Legion did not. This reframes the disappearance entirely. Not a massacre in the fog, not a heroic last stand, but death by dilution. The lesson here is uncomfortable. Empires do not always fall apart loudly. Sometimes they simply forget things that no longer fit. The Ninth Legion becomes a warning about how power manages embarrassment, not with denial, but with silence. And silence is harder to challenge than lies, because there is nothing to argue against. In the next part, we leave the paper trails of Rome behind and cross an ocean, where a single object found in the wrong grave threatens to collapse the boundary between the old world and the new. If the Ninth Legion unsettles us because of absence, the next discovery does the opposite. It exists, and it exists in the wrong place. In 1933, during a controlled archaeological excavation in central Mexico, a small object surfaced from the earth that should have been impossible. Not symbolically impossible, not theoretically inconvenient, chronologically impossible. The excavation took place in the Toluca Valley, west of modern Mexico City, at a site firmly identified as Aztec period. The grave being excavated was sealed, undisturbed, and carefully documented. Its contents were consistent with elite burial practices of the late post-classic period: pottery, ornaments, ritual items. Then the archaeologist uncovered something that did not belong. A small terracotta head, about the size of a clenched fist, bearded, with a moustache, a prominent aquiline nose, deep-set eyes, a fitted cap. None of these features align with pre-Columbian Mesoamerican artistic conventions. In Aztec, Maya, or earlier Central Mexican art, male figures are almost always depicted as clean-shaven. Facial hair is rare to non-existent, reflecting both biological reality and cultural aesthetics. This object did not just deviate from local style, it violated it. When art historians later examined the piece, the problem became worse. Stylistically, the head was Roman, not vaguely Mediterranean, not generically Old World, specifically Roman, matching small figurines produced in the 2nd century AD, often described as grotesques or theatrical miniatures. The proportions, the expression, the treatment of hair and beard, all fit within a known artistic tradition. And yet, it was found in a grave sealed roughly 1,000 years before Columbus. This immediately triggered skepticism. Hoax was the obvious answer. Someone must have planted it, or the grave must have been disturbed, or the excavation notes were sloppy. But the context resisted these explanations. The burial layers were intact. The stratigraphy was clean. The archaeologist was experienced and meticulous. There was no evidence of intrusion from the colonial period, no mixing, no later materials. The object had been buried when the grave was sealed, which leaves only two possibilities. Either the artifact was not Roman, or history was missing something. To resolve this, science stepped in where stylistic analysis could not. In the 1990s, the terracotta head underwent thermoluminescence dating, a method used to determine when fired clay was last heated. When pottery is fired in a kiln, it releases stored energy. Over time, radiation from the environment recharges that energy. Heat it again, and the amount of light released reveals how long it has been since the original firing. The result was deeply inconvenient. The clay dated to approximately 1800 years ago, with the highest probability centered around the Roman imperial period. This ruled out modern forgery. It ruled out colonial era intrusion. It ruled out coincidence. The object was ancient, and it was buried in pre-Columbian Mexico. There is no comfortable explanation for this. One possibility is accidental transoceanic contact. Roman ships traded extensively along the Atlantic coast of Europe and North Africa. We know that vessels were sometimes lost to storms. Ocean current modeling shows that debris from the eastern Atlantic can drift to the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico over the course of months. A shipwreck does not need survivors to transmit objects. A single durable artifact could wash ashore, be recovered, traded inland, and preserved as a powerful foreign relic for generations, eventually buried with an elite individual long after its origin was forgotten. This scenario does not require a Roman expedition to the Americas. It requires only one accident. Another possibility is indirect transmission. Objects move through networks in unpredictable ways. The Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. They interacted with indigenous groups. Could an old Roman object, looted or inherited in Europe, have traveled through centuries of trade before crossing the Atlantic? There is no direct evidence, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The most conservative explanation, that a local artisan coincidentally created a Roman-looking face, fails under scrutiny. Thermoluminescence dating confirms the age of the clay, not just the style, and no comparable objects exist in Mesoamerican contexts. This head is alone, a single data point, and single data points are dangerous. They do not establish new models, but they destabilize existing ones. They sit uncomfortably at the edges of explanation, refusing to be absorbed, like the Shigir idol, like Ain Ghazal, like the Ninth Legion. Each anomaly, on its own, can be dismissed. Together they form a pattern, not of hidden civilizations or secret histories, but of incomplete ones. In the next part, we step back from individual mysteries and confront the larger question they force us to ask. How much of human history survives not because it mattered, but because it got lucky? By the time we reach this point, a pattern begins to surface. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden civilization, but something far more uncomfortable. History is not what happened, it is what survived. The Shigir idol survived because it fell into a chemically perfect bog. The Ain Ghazal statues survived because they were buried, not displayed. Markawasi survived because stone erodes slowly and ambiguity protects it. The Ninth Legion vanished because bureaucracy does not preserve failure. The Roman head survived because clay remembers heat better than paper remembers ink. These objects do not represent the past fairly. They represent the past selectively. This phenomenon has a name in science: survivorship bias. We draw conclusions from the data that remains, while forgetting that most data never makes it to us at all. In archaeology, this bias is extreme. Wood rots, textiles dissolve, paint fades, skin vanishes. What remains are stones, bones, and accidents. And then we build entire narratives around those accidents. The Stone Age is the clearest example. It was not an age defined by stone. It was an age defined by what did not decay. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived in forests, wetlands, and grasslands where wood was abundant and stone was secondary. Their houses were wooden, their tools were wooden, their monuments were wooden, and almost all of it is gone. The Shigir idol is not exceptional because it was unique. It is exceptional because it escaped deletion. This forces a re-evaluation of early human cognition. Symbolic thought, abstraction, and ritual behavior do not suddenly appear with agriculture. They are not inventions of cities. They are older than permanence itself. Humans were thinking symbolically long before they could store those symbols reliably. The Ain Ghazal statues reinforce this. Here we see industrial-scale chemistry, architectural planning, and psychological control mechanisms thousands of years before writing. And then, collapse. The knowledge disappears. The technique is forgotten. Progress is not a staircase. It is a pulse. Technologies emerge, overreach, and vanish. Skills are gained, lost, and rediscovered. Civilizations do not inherit knowledge automatically. They must relearn it or stumble upon it again by chance. The Roman head in Mexico highlights another blind spot: connectivity. We draw clean lines between Old World and New World because they make history manageable. But oceans are not walls. They are systems. Currents move relentlessly, indifferent to human categories. Objects drift. Ideas leak. Contact does not need intention. And finally, the Ninth Legion reminds us that written history is not neutral. It is curated. It preserves success and minimizes embarrassment. What is recorded is not necessarily what mattered most, but what power chose to remember. When all of this is taken together, the neat timeline of human civilization begins to fracture. Not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. We have mistaken absence for simplicity. We have mistaken loss for non-existence. The deep past was not empty. It was fragile, and fragility does not survive well. In the next part, we confront the final implication of these discoveries and ask what they reveal, not about ancient humans, but about us. At a certain point, accumulation becomes confrontation. One anomaly can be dismissed. Two can be debated. 5, spread across continents and millennia, begin to speak. Not in answers, but in implications. The Shigir idol tells us that early humans were capable of monumental symbolic expression, without cities, agriculture, or metallurgy. Meaning did not wait for civilization. Civilization organized meaning that already existed. Ain Ghazal shows us that technological sophistication can appear shockingly early and disappear just as quickly. Industrial chemistry, environmental collapse, and psychological control mechanisms existed before writing, before states, before law codes. Markawasi forces us to reconsider how ancient people related to their environment. The landscape was not a neutral stage. It was active, alive, participatory. The boundary between nature and culture was permeable, and that permeability mattered. The Ninth Legion exposes a weakness in our trust of written records. Bureaucracy preserves what serves it. Silence does not always mean ignorance. Sometimes it means choice. And the Roman head in Mexico confronts us with connectivity. It suggests that the ancient world was not neatly compartmentalized. Objects could move far beyond the limits we impose retroactively. History, it turns out, is porous. Together, these discoveries dismantle a comforting myth that human progress is linear, that knowledge accumulates cleanly, that complexity waits its turn. Instead, they suggest something far less stable. Human history is cyclical, fragile, and heavily edited by chance. We live in a world where most human creativity was biodegradable, where the majority of stories were told in materials that could not last, where what we call origins are often just the earliest things that survived, not the earliest things that existed. This reframes our relationship with the past. We are not standing on a solid foundation of accumulated truth. We are standing on a scattered collection of survivors. Every archaeological discovery is not a window. It is a wound, a tear in the fabric of forgetting that briefly exposes what should have been erased. And that makes the past dangerous, because it means our current assumptions are provisional. The next object pulled from mud, sand, or stone could force another rewrite. Not because history is broken, but because it was never finished. The past is not silent. It is simply buried. In the next and final part, we close this journey by asking what it means to live atop a planet that is still full of sleeping history, and whether we are prepared for what might wake up. We tend to imagine history as something complete, a closed book, a settled argument, a timeline with a beginning, a middle, and a reassuring present. But everything you have just heard argues against that idea. History is not finished. It is paused. Beneath our feet lies a vast archive written in materials that were never meant to last. Wood, fiber, skin, pigment, sound, gesture, belief. Entire civilizations express themselves in ways that biology eventually erased. What remains is not the truth of the past, but the residue of accidents, a peat bog that poisoned decay, a flaw that sealed what should have crumbled, a mountain too large to erase, a bureaucracy that chose silence, a clay object that remembered fire longer than humans remembered its journey. These are not miracles, they are survivors. And survivors distort perception. If the Shigir idol had rotted like every other wooden monument of its age, we would still believe Ice Age humans lacked symbolic depth. If the Ain Ghazal statues had been left standing, weather and iconoclasm would have erased them, and we would never know that industrial chemistry once burned forests to make gods. If Marcahuasi's rocks were smoother, no one would question the passivity of landscapes. If the Ninth Legion had been celebrated or condemned openly, we would not mistake silence for mystery. If the Roman head had shattered instead of enduring, the Atlantic would still feel like an absolute barrier. Each discovery exists because something went wrong with forgetting. This leads to a final, unsettling realization. We do not know how many times human knowledge has risen and fallen. We assume that because we remember something, it has always been remembered. But memory is not cumulative, it is selective. Techniques vanish, skills die with their practitioners, societies collapse and take entire libraries with them, libraries written in perishable form. The past we inherit is not the past that was lived. It is the past that escaped destruction. That should change how we think about our own time. We record more than any civilization before us. But we also build on systems that assume continuity. Digital memory is not immortal. Materials fail, formats decay, power grids collapse. Knowledge that is not practiced becomes knowledge that is lost. The people who carved the Shigir idol did not expect it to last 12,000 years. The builders of Ain Ghazal did not intend their gods to become museum pieces. The makers of the Roman head never imagined it would cross an ocean, and yet, here they are. Not because history protected them, but because chance did. So when we talk about primitive societies, we are often revealing more about our own insecurity than about their reality. Intelligence does not move forward in a straight line. It flares, it contracts, it adapts, it forgets. The ground beneath us is not empty. It is layered with stories that did not make it. Most of human history did not survive to be judged. And that means the past still has the power to surprise us, to embarrass us, to correct us. History is not a completed narrative. It is a sleeper, and every once in a while, chemistry, erosion, or accident nudges it awake, just long enough for us to realize how little of it we truly know. When that happens, the timeline cracks, and through that crack, we glimpse a humanity older, stranger, and more complex than the one we thought we came from. Then the ground closes again, and history goes back to sleep. Even now, as you listen to this, history is still working. Not in libraries, not in archives, but underground. Every city is built on something older. Every road cuts through forgotten ground. Beneath modern foundations lie layers of human activity compressed by time. Objects dropped, buried, abandoned, sealed, or lost without ceremony. Most of them will never be found. Not because they are unimportant, but because the conditions for survival are unforgiving. A few meters too dry and wood turns to dust. A few centuries too exposed and plaster collapses. A single bureaucratic decision, and an entire legion disappears from memory. What archaeology uncovers is not a representative sample of the past. It is the residue of extreme circumstances. A bog, a burial, a collapse, a mistake. This means that the most ordinary human behaviors, the ones repeated daily for generations, are the least likely to survive. What we recover instead are outliers, edge cases, objects that slipped through the cracks of decay, and then we build theories on top of them. This is why the past feels strange. Not because ancient people were alien, but because we are seeing them through a distorted lens. A lens polished by chance, not intention. The Shigir idol feels shocking because we were not supposed to see it. Ain Ghazal feels unsettling because its system failed and vanished. Makahwasi feels ambiguous because belief does not fossilize cleanly. The Ninth Legion feels mysterious because power prefers silence. The Roman head feels impossible because oceans erase context. Together, they form a reminder. The past is not gone. It is incomplete. And that incompleteness is not a flaw in archaeology. It is the nature of memory. It is tempting to treat these discoveries as curiosities, anomalies to be admired and then set aside. But doing so misses their deeper relevance. They are not just about ancient people. They are about us. We like to believe we are exceptional because we are advanced, that our technologies, institutions, and records guarantee permanence. That collapse is something that happens to others. But history suggests otherwise. Knowledge does not vanish because it is wrong. It vanishes because it is unsupported. The people of Ain Ghazal mastered chemistry, and then lost the forest that made it possible. The makers of wooden monuments built cultures that left almost no trace. Empires with vast bureaucracies erased parts of themselves without anyone noticing. Progress did not protect them. Memory did not save them. Only redundancy, practice, and material survival ever do. If that is true, then our own era is not immune. We produce more data than any civilization before us, but data without continuity is just noise. Formats become unreadable. Infrastructure fails. Skills decay when no longer practiced. Future archaeologists may not marvel at our complexity. They may puzzle over our gaps. The most dangerous thing history can give us is confidence. Certainty that we understand where we came from. Certainty that the timeline is settled. Certainty that we know what humans are capable of. The discoveries you have just heard about are dangerous precisely because they undermine that certainty. They do not replace one story with another. They remove the comfort of final answers. They remind us that what we call known history is a thin surface layer over an ocean of loss. And that means humility is not optional. Every time we say, "This could not have happened," the past eventually responds. Sometimes with a piece of wood, sometimes with a buried statue, sometimes with a name that stops appearing. For every Shigir idol recovered, thousands dissolved. For every Ain Ghazal statue buried, countless others crumbled. For every anomaly that breaks the timeline, there are millions that never had the chance. This is the true scale of loss. Not mysterious civilizations hidden from us, but ordinary human worlds erased so completely that we forget to imagine them. The past was loud. What reaches us is quiet. And that quiet can fool us into thinking it was always that way. It wasn't. If there is one idea worth carrying forward, it is this. History is not a straight line. It is a field of fragments. Some rise to the surface, most remain buried. The ground beneath you, wherever you are listening from, is not empty. It is layered with lives, decisions, mistakes and meanings that never made it into books. Occasionally, chemistry pauses decay. Occasionally, someone digs in the wrong place. Occasionally, an object refuses to disappear. And when that happens, the timeline cracks. Not to reveal a secret master plan or a lost golden age, but to remind us that humanity has always been more complex, more capable, and more fragile than we prefer to admit. History is not finished. It is sleeping. And every now and then, it wakes up just long enough to ask us a question. Are you sure you know who you are?